Detective Sandra Wright stood in the doorway of the old mansion. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the trees. Sandra slowly entered the mansion. She knew something terrible had happened here. "Detective, over here," called Officer Brown. He was standing in the large, grand hallway. Sandra walked over to him, her shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor. In the middle of the hallway was a body. It was Mr. James, the owner of the mansion. Sandra knelt down beside Mr. James. He was a very rich man, known for his diamond business. Now he lay still, his eyes open, but seeing nothing. There was a strange, twisted look on his face. Sandra looked closely and saw a small, empty bottle near his hand. "Poison," she thought. "Who found him?" Sandra asked. "The maid, Lucy," said Officer Brown. "She was coming to bring him tea and found him like this." Sandra stood up and looked around. The mansion was old, with tall, dusty bookshelves and heavy curtains. It seemed like a place full of secrets. She walked to the study, where Mr. James spent most of his time. There, on the big wooden desk, was a note. It read, "Meet me at midnight in the library. There is something you must know." Sandra looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. She hurried to the library, a big room full of old books and a large fireplace. The room was empty, but Sandra felt like someone was watching her. Suddenly, there was a noise behind her. She turned quickly, her hand on her gun, but it was only the butler, Mr. Smith. "Detective, I didn't mean to startle you," said Mr. Smith. He was an old man with kind eyes. "I came to see if you needed anything." "Mr. Smith, did you know about this note?" Sandra asked, showing him the paper. Mr. Smith took the note and read it. His face grew pale. "No, I did not. But I know Mr. James had many secrets. He often received mysterious letters." Sandra nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Smith. Please, stay close. I might need your help." Sandra continued to search the library. She found a hidden drawer in the desk. Inside was a small black book. It was Mr. James's diary. She opened it and began to read. The diary was full of strange entries about meetings with unknown people. Mr. James wrote about threats he received and his fears. The last entry was written the day before he died. It said, "I fear someone in this house wants me dead." Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. Someone in the mansion was a murderer. Just then, the clock struck midnight. The sound echoed through the empty mansion. Sandra looked around, feeling the weight of the moment. She heard footsteps outside the library. She quietly moved to the door and peeked out. It was the maid, Lucy. "Lucy, what are you doing here?" Sandra asked. Lucy jumped, her face showing fear. I couldn't sleep, Detective. I keep thinking about Mr. James. It's so horrible." Sandra studied Lucy's face. Was she telling the truth? "Did you see anything unusual tonight?" Sandra asked. Lucy shook her head. "No, nothing. Only that note on his desk." Sandra decided to follow Lucy back to her room. As they walked down the long hallway, Sandra noticed a door slightly open. It was the door to Mr. James's private office. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, and the air felt cold. On the desk, there was another note. It read, "The truth is hidden in the past." Sandra thought hard. What did this mean? She looked around the office and saw old family pictures on the wall. One photograph showed Mr. James as a young man, standing with another young man. On the back of the photograph, it said, "James and Dan, 1980. Who is Dan? Sandra wondered. She went back to the library and searched through the diary again. She found a page where Mr. James mentioned Dan. "Dan knows too much. I must keep him quiet." Sandra's heart raced. She needed to find Dan. The next morning, Sandra called the police station. "I need to know about a man named Dan in the photograph who knew Mr. James in the 1980s. After a few hours, the station called back. "We found him. Dan is Mr. James's brother. He lives in a small town nearby." Sandra drove to the town and found Dan's house. It was small and old, but well kept. Dan opened the door, a tall man with sad eyes. "Detective Wright, I was expecting you," Dan said. "I heard about my brother." "Dan, I need to ask you some questions," Sandra said. "Did you know someone wanted to hurt your brother?" Dan nodded. "Yes, I knew. My brother was not a good man. He did many bad things to get rich. Many people hated him, but he was still my brother." "Do you know who could have done this?" Sandra asked. Dan sighed. "I have an idea, but it might be hard to believe. Our family has many secrets, Detective. Be careful." Sandra left Dan's house with more questions than answers. She drove back to the mansion, thinking hard. She needed to find more clues. Back at the mansion, Sandra searched Mr. James's office again. She found old letters from someone named M. The letters talked about money and threats. Who is M? Sandra wondered. She called Officer Brown. "I need you to find out who M is. Search the records and see if anyone close to Mr. James has a name that starts with M." After a few hours, Officer Brown called back. "Detective, we found it. M is Mary, Mr. James's business partner. She had many fights with him about money." Sandra felt a surge of excitement. She was getting closer to the truth. She called Mary and asked her to come to the mansion. Mary arrived, looking nervous. Sandra led her to the library. "Mary, I need to ask you some questions about Mr. James." Mary nodded. "I'll tell you what I know." Sandra showed her the letters. "Did you write these?" Mary's face turned red. "Yes, I did. But I didn't kill him, Detective. We fought about money, but I would never hurt him." Sandra believed Mary. She needed more proof. That night, Sandra stayed in the mansion. She sat in the library, thinking. Suddenly, she heard a noise. She crept to the hallway and saw a shadow moving toward Mr. James's office. Sandra followed quietly. The shadow slipped into the office. Sandra burst in, her gun ready. "Stop!" The shadow turned. It was Mr. Smith, the butler. He quickly put something in his pocket. Sandra asked to see what he was hiding. He reluctantly handed it over to her. It was a bottle, just like the one found near Mr. James. "Mr. Smith, why?" Sandra asked, her voice shaking. Mr. Smith's eyes were sad. "I love this family, but Mr. James was a cruel man. He hurt so many people I couldn't let it continue." Sandra felt a mix of relief and sadness. She had solved the mystery, but it was a tragic end. As Mr. Smith was taken away, Sandra looked around the old mansion. It was full of secrets, but now it could rest in peace. Question 1. What did Mr. James do for a living? A. He was a famous photographer. B. He was a jewelry maker. C. He was in the diamond business. Question 2. How did Mr. James die? A. From a gunshot. B. He was poisoned. C. He had food poisoning. Question 3. Who was M? A. Mr. James's business partner, Mary. B. Mr. James's sister, Mary. C. Mr. James's business partner, Marcy. Question 4. Where did Mr. James spend most of his time? A. In the library. B. In the study. C. In the garden. Question 5. Why did Mr. Smith kill his employer? A. Because Mr. James was hurting many people. B. Mr. Smith didn't want to continue working at the mansion. C. Mr. Smith was trying to rob his employer.